Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast, where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. I'm Good Faith's Director of Content, D.T. Slouffman. Curtis Chang is off this week. Listeners, have you ever thought about what it means to be a stranger in a strange land? To look for belonging and hope you find it? To come to a new place as an outsider, bringing all of your uniqueness with you? My great-grandparents were just such strangers when they came to America from Czechoslovakia. They traveled across the ocean and were greeted by these words from the Statue of Liberty. "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," cries she. "With silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Now, not every immigrant story is made equal. Not everyone that comes here like my great-grandparents did feels the light from that lamp beside the golden door. As we watch the United States immigration policy change daily before our very eyes, we need to, now more than ever, take a look at the historical narrative of immigration in this country to learn from the past so we don't repeat its failures. We have the perfect guest to help us do just that, to take a look at an immigrant people's story, specifically the Chinese in America. Michael Luo is an executive editor at The New Yorker and thenewyorker.com. Michael leads the magazine's online editorial operation and writes regularly about politics, religion, and Asian American issues. His first book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America, is both a historical account and a personal reflection. Michael's narrative weaves together his amazing archival research with contemporary experiences that make for a powerful commentary on America's struggles with race and belonging. Michael, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. That was actually really moving to hear about your family story.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you could come on and talk about this very thing. And I would be remiss if I didn't start by telling you that before my wife and I moved to Tennessee, we lived in New York City for almost a quarter century. And in that time, I read your reporting, going back to your days at the New York Times. You wrote about the economic woes of 2008 and the ensuing recession. You covered multiple presidential campaigns. And as I recall, you even did a turn in the Times Bureau in Baghdad. So now fast forward a couple decades, and you decide to write your first book and tackle the question, who gets to be an American? I mean, Michael, what made you say, I don't want to do something easy. I'm gonna ask a really big question and see where it leads me.
Yeah, so the origin story of the book, I say it starts in 2016, the fall of 2016, right when I left the Times. It was just before Trump's first election. And the story is I was actually on the street on the Upper East Side with my family after church, and we were with some other friends. Um, and there was a woman who was angry, annoyed at us who were kind of blocking the sidewalk and she was white. As I described her in a piece I wrote about it, was well dressed. She had one of these fancy new iPhones, and she was aggravated, and she rushed by us and muttered under her breath, like, "Go back to China," um, and or go back to your own country, or something along those lines. And I actually rushed after her, and we had this kind of confrontation. I abandoned my daughter in her stroller, um, and and we were kind of yelling at each other on the street, and I in this kind of adrenaline fueled moment. I was like, I was born in this country and she was saying something along the lines of like, go back to your effing country. Um, and so that moment, I actually tweeted about it. I was kind of, we went inside the restaurant and was tweeting about it. And it kind of, this was the golden age of Twitter, and it kind of went viral. And there was this kind of outpouring about it. And I used this hashtag, this is 2016. And that was meant to kind of think about we're in the year 2016, and this is still happening in America. There was a huge outpouring. I remember Bill de Blasio, who was mayor at the time, actually tweeted back at me, and then I ended up writing a piece for the Times that um, it was called an open letter to the woman who yelled at my family to go back to China, and the newspaper published it on the front page, and it led to basically kind of a week-long conversation about race, America, and specific how Asian Americans fit into that. There was this. We actually asked people across the country to send in videos. It was a kind of direct. We asked people to send in direct to camera videos of their own experience with this kind of thing, and that led to its own another kind of viral sort of thing when this video was released. Anyways, that moment, I wrote about the kind of otherness that has plagued Asian Americans in this country. I wrote about how I'm second generation. My parents immigrated from first China, and then to Taiwan, and then came to the United States for graduate school. And my kids were with me, and so that would make them third generation. And I had this kind of emotion in me about will they ever feel like they truly belong? And and I was writing about this kind of sense of disconnection that you can feel as Asian American in this country. So that was 2016. I for a few weeks or months, I was on, and I did national TV interviews. I was on panels, and I found myself kind of speaking for Asian Americans. And the thing about it though is like, um, I actually really didn't know that much about the history of Asians in America, and I was being called upon to speak on this, and I felt a little bit of like an imposter. I remember I was on a panel with Jelani Cobb, who is a staff writer at the New Yorker and a historian by training, and now is the dean of the Columbia Journalism School. And we were on this panel together, and I followed him. He would speak in these giant, eloquent paragraphs that drew upon history of civil rights and enslaved Black Americans, and he'd just be able to connect things to this present moment. And I was just a guy who had somebody, had this ugly experience on the street. The Obviously I would so at that point I was at the Times, and then I just in a couple weeks I was moving to the New Yorker um, in a big new job, and didn't exactly have time to think about a book or write a book. But I continued to think about this question about belonging in America, and I wrote about kind of this exclusionary past that can kind of inform our understanding of the present. And it was the anti-Asian violence kind of outbreak in the pandemic that the Atlanta spa attacks happened in the spring of 2021. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker um, about this history that I actually didn't know much about. A lot of people know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Wasn't just one law, but a series of laws that were passed that excluded Chinese laborers from entry into the country. But the part that I actually was really drawn to and really had no idea about was in the mid 1880s. There was so that the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, and what happened was the Chinese continued to find ways to come into the country, um, and in many cases filed lawsuits, habeas corpus lawsuits to for their right to come in. And and basically there were communities across the American West, the Pacific Coast as they called it back then, that got together and violently expelled the Chinese from their communities, and dozens and dozens. And I think the count, which has been the most comprehensive count, I think has been done by a professor named Beth Lou Williams, who's at Princeton, is something close to 200 communities in the West Coast in around this 1885, 1886 period, drove out the Chinese. And I just didn't know anything about this, and I wrote about this. And that piece became the basis for this book.
So it's essentially you're putting a puzzle together that is your own heritage in a way. But what was heartbreaking to me is I saw example after example after example of, and you just mentioned some of them right there, but of politicians and labor leaders in particular stoking fears
Right.
around the idea of cheap labor,
Yeah.
making Chinese people symbolic of this idea of taking jobs away from white workers. I mean, it seems like these are similar fears that are being stoked to the point of anger, even in America today. I
Yeah.
mean, they go far beyond. Not that what you experienced on the street wasn't horrible, but this
Right.
idea of actually villainizing
Yeah.
entire groups of people and stoking that fear. I couldn't believe as a reader the examples again and again
Right.
and again and again. It was like watching a record spin.
Right.
What was that like for you as you started to
Hmm.
kind of peel away the layers of that as you're
Yeah.
doing that research and go, you know, you're going, man, it took a lot to get us to that point where I had
Right.
my altercation on the sidewalk.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing that you're pointing out actually relates to a big question I had when it came to Chinese exclusion, was and the bigotry and violence. What a question I had was, what was it? Was it race? Was it economics? Was it religion? Was it politics? And the answer is all of the above. But the politics is actually interesting. Chinese started coming in significant numbers to the United States in the gold rush, and at first it was just a few hundred, and then the numbers um, continued to rise, and then even after that, uh, into the late 1860s and the early 1870s, um, Chinese immigration continued to climb. There was actually a big surge around 1869, 1870. It was after this treaty called the Burlingame Treaty, which was an agreement between the United States and the Chinese Empire that actually explicitly made provision for free immigration between the two countries. Um, Around that period, there was an economic downturn, and that played a big role. That they called this downturn the Great Depression before, the Great Depression of the 1930s. But what was it finally that led to the passage of this law in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Law? It actually was, the country was very evenly divided politically between Republicans and Democrats. And remember, this was post-Civil War. Um, the the South was becoming this Democratic redoubt, this stronghold for Democrats,
Mhm.
and the North and Midwest were Republicans strongholds, and they were jockeying for an advantage. And it was the Pacific Coast, the West Coast, that was kind of seen as a decisive uh, um, tipping point for who was going to control um, Congress and the presidency. And so both parties actually started to catered to the West Coast. How was it that the Republican Party, which you remember had freed the slaves,
Right.
and kind of stood for these kind of big ideals of equality, how this party came to really kind of scapegoat and villainize entire people, and it was as it is today, politics. And as you mentioned, they kind of twisted this concept of free labor against the Chinese. This ideology of that what took shape in sort of in response to slavery, and into it they turned that and into a weapon of racial oppression.
What themes did you start to uncover that as you pulled on those strings, it just opened things up for you and made you go, "Oh, I see how we kind of got all the
Right.
way from 18, the mid 1800s to,
Yeah.
2016 interactions
Yeah.
on the streets
Right.
of Manhattan."
It's important to keep in mind that all of this stuff was happening around the same time. The so-called Chinese question, as they called it back then, followed the Negro question, obviously, and this coincided with the vanquishing of Reconstruction, and the spread of Jim Crow, and the subjugation of native peoples on the western frontiers. It's important to understand that all of this stuff, all these histories, obviously continue to refract in American life, and they need to be considered alongside each other. I don't I don't use the term white supremacy uh, uh, very often, and I don't like to use it because I feel like it's the meaning gets lost, and maybe it's I don't know, that feels to me like sometimes there's a lack of precision in the way it's used.
Mm,
Um, but obviously these histories all relate to people who are people of color, people who didn't fit the image of Americans.
sure.
And I think that is, you know, sadly, that is an issue that continues to refract in American life today. And the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of
Right.
1965, which is the legislation that enabled my parents to come to this country, and has led to the demographic transformation that's unfolding today. That law got rid of the national origins quota system that had governed immigration since 1924 in this country.
And
Um,
if I could, for our listeners who haven't read the book, tell us about that. What was the quota system?
yeah, so the quota system, actually, that I was actually interested in when your ancestors came, because it sounds like they came in the early 1900s,
That's right.
and so that would have been before this Immigration Act of 1924, which basically set uh, these quotas for the total number of people could enter the country, enter the United States based on their nationality of origin, and it was a system that largely favored Northern and Western European immigrants, and so folks from Southern and Eastern Europe were really um, discriminated against under this system. There was essentially exclusion of all people from Asia in as part of that same law in 1924, and it was building on the Chinese exclusion laws in terms of, um, the Chinese exclusion laws were the first time that at the federal level there were restrictions on people based on their ethnicity, their race, from entering the country. So the 1965 law um, got rid of that, and I think that that's important to keep in mind as we think about, obviously what's happening in the country today is we're heading towards a at some point in a few decades, uh, white will not be the dominant racial group in the United States, and that was set in motion by this 1965 law, and it was definitively not what the folks who proponents of this law had in mind. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you think about the tensions that are roiling the country today as we speak about immigration.
Michael, I want to jump back to something you mentioned at the top of the show, and that's what happened during the pandemic. Um, right. So as I read your book, I actually went and I started looking some things up on my own, and I found some interesting numbers that I want to pull out and let's unpack some of this. So, following the coronavirus outbreak and ensuing COVID-19 pandemic, reports of discrimination and violence, and this is from Pew Research, towards Asian Americans, reports of discrimination and violence toward Asian Americans increased. And Pew Research of English speaking Asian American adults showed that as of 2021, one third said they feared someone might threaten or physically attack them. In 2022, English speaking Asian adults were also more likely than other racial or ethnic groups to say they had changed their daily routines
Mm,
due to concerns they might be threatened or attacked. And finally, about one third of Asian adults, and that comes out to about 32%, say they
mhm,
personally know an Asian person in the US who has been threatened or attacked because of their race or ethnicity since the COVID-19 pandemic
mhm,
began in 2020. That's stunning to me. I
mhm,
can't think of a time where I've had to
mhm,
change my daily routine because I have concerns that I might be threatened or attacked. And it gets me thinking about what you shared, your interaction on the street, but that was in 2016. That COVID hadn't even happened yet.
right.
So can you, I mean, I can spout numbers all day. And we'll put the Pew Research in our notes,
Yeah.
but can you kind of fill in the missing pieces in that picture and help us understand how do we get to that place?
When you look at my own story, my twin brother and I went to Harvard. We both work good jobs. I work at the New Yorker. Um, um, but at the same time, yes, like, something like what happened to me on the street, that in the Upper East Side can happen to me. And I think that's one of the um, unusual aspects of being an Asian American is how do we kind of tell that story of race when it comes to Asian Americans. In terms of like how we got to that place in the pandemic, um, and what this thing that happened to me in 2016, the fall of 2016. Remember that moment was Trump was a few weeks away from being elected. You could feel this kind of curtain of nativism kind of descending on the country just in his rhetoric. And I definitely thought about that when that happened to me. Um, the other thing so obviously the pandemic, this was when, you had Trump sort of talking about Kung flu and the China virus. There was a lot of um, focus on where this virus had come from. The other thing that's happening today is China is, an economic, national security juggernaut, the biggest rival to the United States in terms of great powers and the new power dynamic in the world. And there is actually in both parties, Republican and Democrat, um, a it's politically fashionable to rail against the Chinese and Chinese influence, and every time and it's true that um, China represents uh, a rival to American economic and national security interests. Every time that is discussed and politicians are kind of have this kind of contest of bellicosity about China, um, I feel that threat level rising, and so I think there are multiple things. I think there's this I think this history of which I think um, Asian Americans, other immigrant groups uh, have worn this label of being strangers to this day, even though our history goes back um, to the 1850s, the middle of the 19th century in America. Um, there is this precarity that just kind of trails us. There is the Trump presidency and the sort of demagogic nativist language that's part of it. There is the threat from China, and all of that kind of combines, I think, for what happened during the pandemic and beyond.
What do we do with that, this perpetual foreigner stereotype?
What do we do about
What do
it?
we do? What do we do with that?
Yeah, yeah,
How do
yeah.
you hold that?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess I'll say two things. Um, I once wrote a story. I once you mentioned in the beginning some of the things I've covered in my
Yeah.
journalism career, and one of them was religion. I've written about religion a lot in my um, career. It's a subject I know well because I go to church and I've thought about. Um, and I once wrote a story early in my career about how hard it was to produce truly multi-ethnic churches. This was
Mm.
just a and the lens I wrote about it through was actually Asian American churches that were trying to become multi-ethnic. This kind of these churches that were started out as immigrant churches, and then they're kind of become second generation churches where their dominant language is English, and uh, and there have been churches that have started that were multi-Asian in their orientation, and many of them have wanted to become uh, multi-ethnic, have blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans all together. As we know, Martin Luther King said that the most segregated hour in America is on a Sunday morning.
Mm.
The thing that I came away with in that story is that um, this is not a great revelation, but uh, we gravitate towards people we're like, and this relates to ethnicity and race and class and education and um, producing um, churches that reflect the diversity of God's creation. That's hard because we're human beings. And so one thing I will say that makes this hard is just human nature. And knowing history and understanding the kind of contingent way that history works and also incorporating narratives that have not traditionally been included into that history is part of the work. And um, and you know so telling the story of that there are Chinese in this country that date back 5 generations. And interestingly, when you think about it, if it were not for Chinese exclusion and these laws that prevented that made it very difficult for Chinese to enter the country, um, this community was almost it's almost like like a tree root that was blocked by a boulder or something like that, and prevented from growing. And imagine where we would be as a country today if actually the Chinese community had been allowed to continue to grow in the way that the Irish grew around the same time explosively, and they became American citizens and developed a political voice. Imagine if that had happened, we would be we would be probably in a very different place as a country. And I think that this question of belonging that I wrestled with, and that I'm worried my kids will wrestle with, would be I think that feeling would be very different today.
Mm. Michael, this is all so fascinating and in some ways sad. I'm curious as we think of this through a lens of faith, why does belonging matter so much?
Mm,
Uh, Not even necessarily American, but
yeah,
why does belonging matter so much?
longing. Yeah, I mean that's what we all want, right? The deepest need of the human heart is to know and be known, and that is, ultimately for people of faith, where um, you look for that belonging, that maybe that sense of kind of alienation, and sometimes not quite feeling that you belong here on earth, and that and people look for that um, answer. um, but yeah, like that is, I think it's funny. I love that we're talking about the word. When we were debating the title of my book, the subtitle of the book, I'd always pick Strangers in the Land. I always, from the very beginning, when I set out in this book, I thought I was going to call it Strangers in the Land. It relates to a Supreme Court decision that upheld one of these exclusion laws, and the justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the majority opinion referred to the Chinese as strangers in the land.
Mm.
The the subtitle, which is Exclusion Belonging: The Epic Story of the Chinese in America, I knew that exclusion was going to be part of the subtitle because that's like essentially the way I described it, is like a narrative history of Chinese exclusion in America. And it was a late idea to add the word belonging to that little series of kind of describing the book. And I'm so glad I did, because that ultimately is um, the theme, the larger theme of the book.
Well, we're all longing for home, uh, whether it be in a spiritual sense or a real world physical sense. We want belonging. And I was so moved by this book. I highly recommend it to all of our listeners. Michael Luo, author of Strangers in the Land and Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of the Good Faith Podcast. And listeners, if you like the stories that we tell here at Good Faith, make sure to go rate us, leave a review, and follow us anywhere you listen to the Good Faith Podcast. And we will see you all once again around the campfire next week.